She had 48 hours to pack 42 years of living into cardboard boxes. And somewhere between wrapping the coffee mugs her late husband had glazed by hand and pulling the last of his flannel shirts from the bedroom closet, Vivian Pruitt made a decision that would lead her to a crumbling cabin in the mountains, a sealed vault buried beneath the floorboards, and a secret worth more than $2 million. A secret that powerful men had killed to keep buried. If stories like this keep you coming back, take a moment right now to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday in November, taped to the front door of apartment 4B at 418 Cranston Street, South Boston. It was not a letter. It was not a request. It was a single sheet of legal paper printed in a font so small and dense it seemed designed to be unreadable staple to a county filing that carried the full weight of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts behind it. Vivian stood in the hallway in her house slippers, reading it twice, 3 times, holding it at arm's length, because her reading glasses were sitting on the kitchen counter, next to a half-finished cup of Earl Grey that was already going cold. 42 years. She had moved into this apartment in the summer of 1982 with Harold Pruitt, her husband of 3 years at the time, when they were both young enough to carry a couch up 4 flights of narrow stairs without stopping to catch their breath. Harold was a master carpenter who could look at a warped doorframe and know just by running his thumb along the grain whether it could be saved. Vivian was 23 years old, freshly hired as a teller at Dorchester Savings Credit Union, and pregnant with their daughter Claire, though neither of them knew it yet. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Harold had spent their first weekend replacing every cabinet hinge in the kitchen, because the original squeaked, and Vivian had watched him from the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee, thinking that this was the place where everything good would happen. And it did. Claire took her first steps on the living room hardwood, gripping the edge of the radiator cover Harold had built from reclaimed oak. The bedroom window faced east, and every morning for 4 decades, the sun crept across the quilt in a slow golden stripe that Harold called the day's first measuring line. He had a way of turning everything into a measurement. Time, love, grief. He measured the world with a copper folding ruler he kept in the breast pocket of his work shirt, a 6-fold Lufkin from 1961 that had belonged to his own father. The brass hinges were worn smooth. The inch markings had faded at the edges, but it was precise. Harold trusted it more than any laser tool on the market, and he used it every single day of his working life until the morning he collapsed in the bathroom of the apartment they had shared for 37 years and did not get up. That was 5 years ago. Vivian had kept the ruler in the top drawer of his toolbox, resting on a clean shop rag folded shut, waiting for hands that would never open it again. Now she stood in the hallway with an eviction notice and no husband and no idea what came next. The entity behind the notice was called Stonebridge Partners, LLC. Vivian had never heard the name. The building at 418 Cranston had been owned for decades by a small local property group that had always been reasonable, even kind. But 6 months earlier, the ownership had changed. It happened quietly, buried in a transfer of deed that none of the tenants were informed about. Stonebridge acquired the entire block through a subsidiary corporation registered in Delaware, and within weeks, a man named Roland Prescott appeared. Prescott was the director of asset operations for Stonebridge. He was 46 years old, expensively dressed, and possessed the particular brand of courtesy that exists only to make cruelty feel procedural. He smiled when he delivered bad news. He called elderly tenants by their first names without being invited to. He walked through the hallways of 418 Cranston with a tape measure and a clipboard, taking notes that no one was allowed to see, and when Mrs. Donnelly on the 2nd floor asked him what he was measuring, he had smiled his wide, empty smile and said, "Just making sure everything's up to code, Patricia." Everything was not up to code. That was the point. Stonebridge's legal team invoked the Substantial Renovation Clause, a provision in Massachusetts housing law that allowed landlords to bypass rent control protections if the building required structural overhaul so extensive that the premises had to be entirely vacated. It was a legitimate law designed for genuine emergencies. It had become a weapon. Developers across the city had learned to manufacture structural deficiencies on paper, hire engineers willing to sign affidavits describing urgent foundation concerns, and file for full building evictions that cleared the way for luxury conversions. The tenants were collateral. The buildings were the product. Vivian did not go quietly. She pooled what little money she had with the Kowalski family on the third floor and the retired longshoreman Arthur Beale on the first, and together they hired a housing attorney named Martin Cavanaugh. Cavanaugh operated out of a two-room office above a dry cleaner on Dorchester Avenue. He was 68 years old, heavy-set with a voice like gravel dragged across concrete and a deep visceral contempt for corporate real estate developers that had only sharpened with age. He took their case at a reduced rate because he had seen this play 100 times, and it made his blood boil every single time. For 4 months they fought. Cavanaugh filed motions to challenge the structural assessment. He subpoenaed Stonebridge's engineering reports and found inconsistencies. He argued before a housing court judge that the renovation clause was being weaponized to displace protected tenants. But Stonebridge had retained a litigation firm with 14 attorneys on the case, and they responded to every motion with a blizzard of counter-filings that buried Cavanaugh's small operation in paper. They delayed hearings. They requested continuances. They filed discovery demands so broad they would have required Vivian to produce bank statements from the last 7 years. The strategy was not to win on merit. It was to bleed the tenants dry until they could no longer afford to resist. It worked. Arthur Beale ran out of money first. He dropped out of the suit in month 3. The Kowalskis followed 2 weeks later, accepting a relocation payment of $4,000, roughly 1 month's rent, in the current Boston market. And on a gray Friday morning in March, the judge ruled in favor of Stonebridge Partners, citing the engineer's affidavit and the scope of the proposed renovations. Vivian was given 48 hours to vacate. She sat on the edge of her bed that evening, in the room where Harold had died, and looked at the boxes she had started packing. The quilt was folded on top of a stack of linens. The framed photographs were wrapped in newspaper. The kitchen was dismantled, and on the nightstand, still sitting where she had placed it that morning, was Harold's toolbox. She opened the top drawer, took out the copper folding ruler, and held it in both hands. The metal was cold. The weight was familiar. She folded it open, then closed it, then open again, the brass hinges clicking softly in the silence of the room. "Measure the silence," Harold used to say. "When you are cutting a joint and you are not sure if it is true, stop. Put down the saw and listen to the gap, because the gap will tell you what the numbers already know." Vivian closed the ruler and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. She did not cry. She had done her crying 5 years ago, and she had discovered that grief, once you have walked all the way through it, leaves you with a kind of stillness that other people sometimes mistake for fragility. It is not fragility. It is the quiet that comes after every measurement has been taken and every number has been written down, and there is nothing left to do but cut. The Boston rental market offered her nothing. First month last month, security deposit. At current rates, a studio apartment in a safe neighborhood would require nearly $8,000 just to walk through the door. Her Social Security check covered groceries and utilities. Her pension from the credit union was modest. After the legal fees and the cost of 4 months of fighting, her savings account held exactly $19,800. It was too much to qualify for emergency housing assistance. It was nowhere near enough to rent in the city she had called home for 7 decades. She began searching foreclosure listings at the public library on a computer, so old the keyboard letters had worn smooth. She was not looking for a home. She was looking for a foothold, any piece of ground that no landlord could ever pull out from under her again. The listing appeared on a Berkshire County tax auction page halfway down a list of properties seized for unpaid taxes. The photograph was a single grainy image clearly taken years ago showing a dark A-frame structure surrounded by dense trees. The details were sparse. Location: Harrowfield, Berkshire County, Massachusetts. Western Berkshire's bordering state forest. Lot 3.8 acres unmanaged mixed hardwood. Structure: A-frame cabin approximately 1,100 square feet. Built circa 1971. Condition: Assis. No warranty expressed or implied. Starting bid $14,500. Cash only. The previous owner was listed as Silas J. Drummond, deceased. No heirs located. 11 years of unpaid property taxes. Vivian stared at the screen for a very long time. It was nearly 3 hours from Boston, deep in the western mountains, in a region she had never visited. The cabin was clearly a ruin. There was no mention of running water, functional plumbing, or intact wiring. She would be 75 years old, alone in the middle of a forest with no neighbors and no safety net. She wired the money the next morning. The drive west on the Massachusetts Turnpike was a slow unraveling of everything familiar. The city thinned to suburbs. The suburbs dissolved into farmland. The farmland rose into wooded hills that grew steeper and darker with every mile. By the time Vivian turned off the highway and onto a 2-lane county road winding through the Berkshires, the cell signal on her phone had dropped to a single flickering bar, and the only signs of human habitation were the occasional mailbox standing at the mouth of an unpaved drive. She stopped for lunch at a diner in Harrowfield, a town with a gas station, a hardware store, a post office, and not much else. The diner was called Buckley's, and it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and wood smoke, and there were 6 people inside who all seemed to know each other. Vivian ordered a bowl of soup and a cup of coffee and sat at the counter because the booths felt too large for one person. The woman behind the counter was named Ruth. She was about 60, broad-shouldered with short silver hair and hands that moved with the efficient grace of someone who had poured 10,000 cups of coffee and remembered how every regular took theirs. She set Vivian's soup down without ceremony and asked if she was passing through. "I just bought a property outside of town," Vivian said. "The old Drummond place up on Wyatt Ridge Road." The diner did not go silent the way it happens in films. There was no dramatic pause, no dropped fork. But something shifted. Ruth's hand hesitated on the coffee pot just for a moment, and her eyes moved to a man sitting 2 stools down, a weathered man in a canvas jacket who had been reading a folded newspaper. He looked up. He looked at Ruth. Then he looked at his coffee and said nothing. Ruth set the pot down and leaned against the counter. "Well," she said, "that is a piece of property that has been sitting empty for a reason." Vivian waited. Silas Drummond was not a man people understood. Ruth continued, choosing her words like someone stepping across wet stones. "He moved out here sometime in the early 70s, bought that land, built that cabin with his own hands, and then spent the next 40-some-odd years making sure nobody ever got close to it. No visitors, no friends. Drove into town once a month for supplies, paid cash, never said more than 6 words to anyone. Some folks figured he was just an odd bird who wanted to be left alone. Others thought he was running from something." She paused, wiping the counter with a cloth. "He was not a man who left a mess behind. So when he died up there, and nobody found him for 3 weeks, and the county came in and found that cabin locked up tighter than a military installation, people talked. They said Silas was not just hiding from the world. He was hiding something inside that house." The man in the canvas jacket folded his newspaper, stood, dropped 2 bills on the counter, and walked out without a word. "Just watch your step on that ridge," Ruth said. "The land remembers what was put into it." Vivian finished her soup. She left a generous tip. She drove the remaining 7 miles up a winding gravel road that narrowed to a rutted dirt track for the last quarter mile, and when the trees finally opened into a small clearing and the A-frame came into view, she turned off the engine and sat in the car for a full minute, gripping the steering wheel before she could bring herself to step outside. The cabin was worse than the photograph. The roof sagged in the center like a broken spine. The windows on the upper level were boarded shut. The porch steps had rotted through entirely, leaving dark gaps that dropped into the crawl space below. Vines had climbed the south-facing wall and worked their way under the cedar shingles, prying them loose one by one over years of patient vegetative assault. The front door was padlocked with a heavy chain, but the padlock was so corroded that it crumbled when Vivian struck it with a rock from the driveway. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and damp earth, and something older, something mineral and cold, like the breath of a cave. The hardwood floors were warped and stained. The wallpaper hung in long curling strips, yellowed and brittle. The kitchen sink was filled with dead leaves that had blown in through a crack in the window above it. Everything was coated in a fine grey dust that had not been disturbed in years. Vivian set her suitcase down in the center of the living room and stood very still. The silence was immense. Not the silence of a city apartment at night where the background hum of traffic and plumbing and distant television sets fills the air with a low, constant vibration. This was a total silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of the sound of your own heartbeat. She reached into her cardigan pocket and wrapped her fingers around Harold's copper ruler. The metal had warmed against her body. She held it and breathed and let the silence settle around her, like the first snowfall of the season, soft and absolute and covering everything. She slept that night on an air mattress on the living room floor, wrapped in the quilt from the bed she had shared with Harold, and she did not sleep well. But she woke up in a house that belonged to her. The first 3 weeks were a test of endurance that Vivian had not expected to pass. She was 75 years old, and her knees ached in the mornings and her hands cramped after an hour of gripping tools. But anger is a fuel that burns hotter than youth, and Vivian Prewitt was angry in a way that had settled into her bones like a low-grade fever that would not break. She tore out the rotting drywall with a pry bar and a claw hammer. She scrubbed the hardwood floors on her hands and knees with a brush and a bucket of bleach solution until the grain emerged golden and intact beneath decades of grime. She patched the roof with tar paper and roofing nails, climbing a ladder she had bought at the Harrowfield hardware store, and bracing herself against the pitch of the A-frame with one hand while she hammered with the other. Her remaining savings stretched further than she had imagined. Without rent, without a mortgage, without the slow monthly hemorrhage of urban living, the money became material. Lumber, nails, caulk, sandpaper. Each purchase was a small act of defiance against the corporation that had put her here, and she tracked every cent in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer the way she had tracked every transaction for 35 years behind the counter at Dorchester Savings. It was during the 4th week on a cold morning, when frost still clung to the inside of the windows, that Vivian took out Harold's copper folding ruler for the first time since arriving. She had been planning to install new baseboards along the living room walls, and she needed accurate measurements for the lumber order. She unfolded the ruler with the familiar click of brass hinges and began measuring the interior walls, writing the figures on a scrap of cardboard with a carpenter's pencil she had found in Harold's toolbox. The cabin was simple, a rectangle. The living room and kitchen occupied the front half, the single bedroom, and a small bathroom filled the rear, and between them stood a massive floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace built from river rock with a chimney that rose through the center of the A-frame to the peak of the roof. It was the kind of fireplace a man builds when he wants to heat a house through a New England winter without relying on anyone or anything from the outside world. Vivian measured the living room. She measured the kitchen. She measured the bedroom. She added the figures together, accounted for wall thickness, and wrote the total on her cardboard. Then she went outside, extended the ruler along the foundation, and measured the exterior length of the cabin. She stood in the cold morning air, looking at the 2 numbers, and felt something shift in her chest. A faint vibration, a hum of recognition. The exterior measured 38 feet. The combined interior measurements plus standard wall thickness totaled 31 feet. 7 feet were missing. A chimney and fireplace could account for 2 feet of depth, perhaps 3 in a large masonry structure. Not 7. Not unless the fireplace was a solid block of stone 4 feet wider than it appeared from either side, which made no architectural sense at all. Vivian walked back inside. She stood in front of the fireplace and placed her open palm flat against the river rock. It was cold and rough and unyielding. She knocked with her knuckles. Solid. She moved to the left side and knocked again. Solid. She crouched and knocked along the base where the stone met the hardwood floor. Solid, solid, solid. She closed the ruler, slipped it back into her pocket, and stood in the middle of the living room listening. Measure the silence. The gap will tell you what the numbers already know. The basement was a cramped, unfinished cellar with a dirt floor and a ceiling so low that Vivian had to duck beneath the floor joists. She had avoided it for weeks because it smelled of sulfur and damp clay, and because the wooden stairs groaned under even her modest weight. Now she descended with a heavy flashlight in one hand and Harold's ruler in the other, though she did not need the ruler anymore. She needed only her eyes. The beam of the flashlight swept across the dirt floor, the poured concrete foundation walls, the tangle of old copper pipes, and stopped. There, rising from the dirt floor to the wooden joists above, directly beneath the fireplace, was a wall that did not belong. It was made of grey cinder blocks stacked roughly, the mortar smeared, and uneven, entirely different in material and craftsmanship from the poured concrete that formed the rest of the foundation. The concrete was professional. The cinder blocks were the work of a man who knew what he was hiding, but did not care if the masonry was beautiful, only that it was thick. Vivian set the flashlight on an overturned crate, so the beam held steady on the wall. She climbed back up the stairs, crossed the living room, and opened Harold's toolbox. She lifted out the 10-pound sledgehammer he had used for decades to drive stakes and break stubborn joints. It was heavier than she remembered. The hickory handle was dark with age and the oils of his palms. She carried it back down to the basement. She stood before the false wall, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 128 pounds, 75 years old, holding her dead husband's hammer in both hands. She thought about the eviction notice. She thought about Roland Prescott's smile. She thought about Ruth's voice at the diner, saying the land remembers what was put into it. She swung. The impact jolted through her wrists, her elbows, her shoulders. A web of cracks spread across the center cinder block. Dust sifted down from the joists above. She adjusted her grip, widened her stance, and swung again. Harder. The block fractured. A piece the size of her fist broke free and fell backward into darkness, and from the hole came a rush of cold, stale air carrying a scent she recognized from 35 years of handling currency, the sharp, unmistakable smell of old paper and ink and metal. She swung again and again. Each blow sent shudders through the frame of the house, and each blow opened the hole wider, and the cold air kept coming. And the smell grew stronger until the opening was large enough for the flashlight beam to reach through and illuminate what lay beyond. It was a room, a perfect square roughly 8 feet by 8 feet, concealed beneath the mass of the stone chimney above. And built into the far wall, bolted to a reinforced steel frame that had been sunk into the earth itself, was a door. Vivian had spent 35 years working in a financial institution. She had walked past the vault at Dorchester Savings Credit Union every single working day of her adult life. She knew what a vault door looked like, the way a sailor knows what a horizon looks like, not because she had studied it, but because it had simply always been there, solid and certain, and part of the architecture of her existence. The door in front of her was a Mosler, 6 feet tall, circular, brushed steel dulled by decades of basement air, but free of rust. Heavy locking bolts radiated from the center like the spokes of a wheel. A combination dial sat at chest height, flanked by a large spoked turn handle. It was the kind of door that had once guarded the reserves of regional banks across New England, weighing well over a ton, engineered to resist cutting torches and explosives and the slow, patient work of time itself. It was sitting in the basement of a $14,000 cabin in the woods. Vivian lowered the sledgehammer. She reached into her pocket and took out Harold's copper ruler, not to measure anything, but because she needed to hold something real, something honest, something that had never lied to her. The brass hinges clicked softly. as her thumb moved along the folded edge. She stared at the vault door and understood with a clarity that felt like ice water pouring down her spine that Silas Drummond had not built this cabin on a piece of empty land. He had built this cabin around this vault. The structure above was an afterthought. The house was a disguise. The real architecture was underground, sealed behind cinder blocks, and silence waiting in the dark for someone patient enough, desperate enough, to measure the gap and listen to what it had to say. Vivian stood in the cold basement alone, holding a dead man's ruler and staring at a locked steel door that had no business existing in this place. And she felt for the first time since the eviction notice had been taped to her door something other than grief or anger. She felt afraid. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the air mattress in the living room, directly above the hidden room, staring at the underside of the A-frame rafters, and listened to the silence of the house with a new and terrible awareness. The cabin had changed. It was no longer a broken thing she was repairing. It was a shell, a costume draped over something she did not yet understand. And every creak of settling wood and every gust of wind pressing against the boarded windows carried a different weight now, as though the structure itself were breathing around the secret it had held for half a century. By dawn, she had made her decision. Not because the fear had passed, but because she had lived long enough to know that fear left unattended does not diminish. It calcifies. It becomes the wall you build around yourself. And then it becomes the wall someone else builds around you. And then one day you realize you are standing in a room with no doors, wondering how you got there. She had already lost one home to a locked door she could not open. She would not let it happen again. The Harrowfield Hardware and Supply occupied a cinder-block building on the main road, sandwiched between the post office and a shuttered insurance agency. The interior smelled of sawdust and machine oil, and the particular mineral tang of galvanized steel. It was the kind of store where every item had a specific place on a specific shelf, and the owner could find a 3/8 carriage bolt in the dark. That owner was Lyle Burridge. He was somewhere north of 70 with a lean frame and deep-set eyes and hands so permanently stained with rust and wood finish that they looked like they had been carved from walnut. He wore the same canvas apron every day, pockets heavy with pencils and wire nuts. And he had the quiet, unhurried manner of a man who had spent his life solving other people's problems one fastener at a time. Vivian had been in the store 3 times in the preceding weeks buying roofing nails and caulk and bleach. Each visit had been transactional. Polite nods, correct change, nothing more. But this morning she walked through the door with a list written on the back of a grocery receipt. And when she handed it to Lyle, something in his expression shifted. He read the list without speaking. Industrial angle grinder. Diamond-tipped cutting wheels. Quantity 12. Tungsten carbide drill bits assorted. Heavy-duty pry bar. Steel punch set. He looked up from the list and looked at her. And there was no judgment in his face, only a slow, careful recognition of something he had perhaps been expecting. "You are not putting up shelves," he said. "No," Vivian replied. "I am not." He folded the list and tucked it into his apron pocket and walked to the back of the store without another word. He returned carrying a battered metal toolbox of his own, and for the next 20 minutes he stood at the counter and walked her through every item, not as a salesman, but as a teacher. He showed her how to change cutting wheels on the grinder without cross-threading the arbor nut. He explained which drill bits would hold their edge against hardened steel and which would snap on the first pass. He wrapped the pry bar in a shop rag and set it beside the steel punches and said, "If you are cutting into something heavy, wear ear protection and keep your face shield down. Steel throws sparks at 2000 degrees, and they will find the 1 square inch of skin you forgot to cover." He rang up the total. It was more than she wanted to spend, but less than she expected. He carried the bags to her car, set them in the trunk, and closed it with both hands. "Whatever is down there," he said, "you be careful with it." Vivian looked at him. "Ruth mentioned you bought the Drummond place," Lyle said. "And Silas Drummond was a man who built things to last. If he sealed something up, he sealed it for a reason. He paused. But reasons have a way of changing when the person who made them is no longer around to defend them. You do what you need to do. He turned and walked back into the store, and Vivian stood in the gravel parking lot holding her car keys and understanding for the first time since arriving in Harrowfield that she was not quite as invisible as she had believed. The work began that afternoon, and it was nothing like she imagined. The angle grinder was a violent instrument. The moment she pressed the trigger and touched the spinning disc to the steel casing around the vault's locking mechanism, the basement erupted into a storm of noise and light that seemed too large, too ferocious for the small hidden room. Sparks fountained off the steel in bright orange arcs, ricocheting off the cinder block walls and dying in the dirt floor like tiny falling stars. The sound was a sustained metallic shriek that climbed the walls and pounded against the low ceiling and filled her skull until she could feel it vibrating in her molars. She lasted 9 minutes before the first cutting wheel shattered. The disc exploded with a sharp crack, sending fragments spinning into the dark corners of the room. Vivian dropped the grinder and stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs, her safety goggles spattered with steel dust. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not unscrew the arbor nut to mount a replacement wheel. She sat on an overturned bucket in the corner of the hidden room, breathing hard, staring at the vault door, and thought about Harold. Harold, who could cut a mortise joint so clean you could not fit a playing card into the seam. Harold, who once spent 6 hours sharpening a single hand plane because the blade had a nick the size of an eyelash, and he refused to let the wood feel it. Harold, who would have looked at this vault door and understood exactly how it was built, and exactly how to take it apart, not with force, but with patience and geometry, and the calm certainty that every locked thing has a weakness if you are willing to look long enough. She took the copper ruler out of her pocket. She unfolded it. She measured the steel casing around the locking mechanism, not because the measurement mattered, but because the act of measuring steadied her hands and slowed her breathing, and reconnected her to the discipline that Harold had spent 40 years teaching her, without either of them knowing it was a lesson. She mounted a new carting wheel. She adjusted her grip. She lowered the face shield and pressed the grinder to the steel, and held it there this time, bracing her left hand against the door frame, letting the vibration travel through her arm and into the structure of the vault itself, rather than rattling through her wrists. She worked in shifts, 40 minutes of cutting, then 20 minutes of rest. She drank water from a thermos and ate crackers and cheese, standing in the kitchen above looking out the window at the tree line while her ears rang, and the smell of burnt steel clung to her clothes and her hair. Each day she returned to the basement and picked up where she had left off, grinding deeper into the hardened casing, feeling the resistance change as the disc moved from the outer shell to the tempered inner housing. She broke 3 drill bits on the second day. The tungsten shattered against a layer of case-hardened steel that Lyle had warned her about, sending a sharp ping through the hidden room like a tuning fork struck against stone. She climbed the stairs, drove to the hardware store, and bought 3 more. Lyle did not ask how the first set had broken. He simply handed her the replacements and said slow and steady, "Let the bit do the work. Your job is just to hold it straight." On the 3rd day, she returned from the basement to find a cardboard box on the cabin's front porch. There was no note, no name. Inside was a thermos of hot soup, a loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper, and a pair of heavy leather work gloves, the kind with reinforced palms and long cuffs that covered the wrists. The gloves were used, but clean-sized for hands slightly larger than her own, and they smelled faintly of linseed oil. She never learned who left them. She wore the gloves for the rest of the work, and they fit well enough. On the evening of the 4th day, after burning through 9 cutting wheels and snapping 5 drill bits and filling the hidden room with a haze of steel dust that turned the flashlight beam into a solid white column, Vivian felt the drill punch through the inner tumbler housing. The bit plunged forward with a sudden lurch, and from deep inside the door came a sound like a heavy bolt dropping into a metal tray. She withdrew the drill. She picked up the steel punch and the sledgehammer. She positioned the punch against the exposed locking pin, drew back the hammer, and drove it home. The impact sent a deep resonant clang through the vault door, through the hidden room, through the foundation of the cabin, and up into the floorboards above. She felt it in the soles of her feet. She set down the hammer. She gripped the spoked turn handle with both gloved hands and pulled. The door resisted for one long terrible second, and then something inside the mechanism surrendered, and the massive steel disc swung outward on its hinges with a groan so deep and prolonged, it sounded like the earth itself was exhaling. Stale air poured out of the opening. It was cold and dry and carried the concentrated smell of old paper and ink and the faint chemical sweetness of decomposing plastic. Vivian picked up the flashlight and stepped through the door. The vault was lined with heavy steel shelving on 3 walls. On the left, stacked in neat rows, were sealed military-grade ammunition crates, olive drab with stenciled markings. Beside them sat a vintage shortwave radio setup, its dials and knobs frozen in position. The cables coiled and clipped with a precision that spoke of training rather than hobby. On the right, a row of metal filing boxes, each labeled with a handwritten index card. But the center of the room stopped her. A heavy wooden desk pushed against the back wall held 2 distinct collections. On the left side of the desk, arranged in a tall stack, were leather-bound ledgers, dozens of them. Their spines were cracked and darkened with age, and the leather had the dry, powdery texture of something that had been sealed away from light and air for decades. On the right side, a rolled bundle of large-format paper tied with cotton string. And in front of the desk, arranged in 4 neat rows on a lower shelf, were bricks. Not masonry bricks, currency bricks. Thick rectangular blocks of $100 bills, each wrapped tightly in clear plastic, each bound with a white paper band stamped with ink. Vivian set the flashlight on the filing boxes, so the beam washed across the shelf at an angle illuminating the paper bands. She did not need to step closer. She had read those bands 10,000 times in her career. She had stacked them, sorted them, counted them, fed them into machines that verified their authenticity and their denomination and their serial numbers. She knew the typography, the ink color, the weight of the paper, the way the routing stamp sat slightly off-center on the older series, because the printing press at the Boston branch had a misaligned plate that was not corrected until 1987. Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Series 1982. The bills were uncirculated. They had never been handled, never been folded into a wallet or smoothed flat on a counter. The sequential serial numbers visible through the plastic wrapping confirmed it. This was not cash that had been collected over time, skimmed from transactions earned through any form of commerce, legal or otherwise. This was a single extraction, a block of currency removed from the Federal Reserve System before it entered circulation, preserved in the exact condition in which it had left the printing press. Vivian counted the bricks, 47. At $10,000 per brick, she was looking at approximately $2 million in stolen federal currency that was as useless as wallpaper. Spending even a single bill would trigger a serial number flag in the Treasury Department's tracking system. It was evidence, not money. A museum exhibit sealed in a tomb. She left the cash where it was and turned to the desk. She untied the cotton string on the rolled paper and spread the first sheet flat. It was a blueprint printed on heavy stock, faded to a pale blue, but still perfectly legible. The schematic showed a building in cross-section floor by floor, with detailed notations for structural load points, utility conduits, elevator shafts, and what appeared to be a reinforced subterranean vault complex. The stamp in the bottom right corner was small and precise and absolutely unmistakable. United States Federal Reserve Bank, Boston Branch. Architectural Survey, Restricted Distribution, 1979. Vivian's hands were steady as she rolled the blueprint back up, because her hands had always been steady when she was handling things that mattered. It was the rest of her that was trembling. She opened the first ledger. The handwriting was small, cramped, meticulous. Every entry was dated. Every figure was cross-referenced with an alphanumeric code that corresponded to a master index glued inside the front cover. It was not a diary. It was not a confession. It was a work product. The careful professional documentation of a man who understood that financial crimes, like legitimate accounting, required impeccable records. For the next 3 days, Vivian did almost nothing else. She carried the ledgers upstairs one at a time, spread them on the kitchen table beside a pot of coffee and a legal pad, and read them the way she had once read the monthly audit reports at Dorchester Savings, methodically, sequentially, with a pencil in her hand, to mark discrepancies and a running tally in the margins. She did not skim. She did not skip ahead. She read every page, every entry, every coded notation, and she let the architecture of the crime reveal itself at its own pace. Silas Drummond had been a ghost payroll architect, a financial engineer of extraordinary skill who had operated inside the machinery of the Boston underworld during the 1970s and early 1980s, constructing shell corporations and layered trusts that converted illicit cash into legitimate real estate holdings. He worked for one client, Gennaro Angiulo, the underboss of the Patriarca crime family who had controlled the Boston rackets from a nondescript office in the North End, laundering millions through a network of commercial properties that stretched across the city. The ledgers documented everything, every property purchased, every shell entity created, every transfer of funds from Angiulo's operations through Drummond's labyrinth of corporate fronts and into the deed registries of Suffolk and Middlesex counties. It was a complete forensic map of a criminal empire's financial infrastructure, written in the hand of the man who had built it. And then, in 1983, when the FBI arrested Angiulo in a historic takedown that dismantled the Patriarca family's Boston operations, Silas Drummond had done what any architect does when he sees the building starting to collapse. He removed the most valuable thing from the structure and ran. He stole $2 million from a Federal Reserve currency transfer. He took the architectural blueprints of the Boston branch as insurance, a dead man's switch-proof, that he had access to information so sensitive the government would negotiate rather than prosecute. And he vanished into the Berkshires, built a cabin around a bank vault he had somehow acquired and installed before anyone came looking, and spent the next 4 decades alone in the woods, keeping records of the empire he had abandoned. That was what chilled Vivian most. He had kept watching. The newest ledger, bound in lighter leather, contained entries dated as recently as 3 years before his death. Drummond had tracked the evolution of his own shell companies as they passed through decades of corporate mergers, acquisitions, and name changes. He had followed the money the way an astronomer follows a comet, patiently, obsessively charting its trajectory through the dark. She found the entry on a Thursday afternoon. She was on her 4th cup of coffee, and her 2nd legal pad, and the light coming through the kitchen window had shifted from white to amber. And she almost missed it because the handwriting on that particular page was slightly smaller than the rest, as though Drummond had been writing faster, or with more urgency, or perhaps with the grim satisfaction of a man watching a prediction come true. Asset Tracking Entity Transfer Log, Property 409, Original Shell. Harborview Associates, established 1981. Current holding Stonebridge Partners, LLC, status active gentrification. Phase 4. In the margin in pencil so faint she had to hold the page at an angle to the light, Drummond had written a physical address. It was 418 Cranston Street, South Boston. Vivian set the pencil down. She placed both hands flat on the table. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way the cardiac nurse had taught Harold to do in the months before his heart decided to stop. And she held very still while the information rearranged itself inside her mind, like tumblers falling into alignment inside a lock. Stonebridge Partners, Roland Prescott, the substantial renovation clause, the army of corporate litigators, the eviction notice taped to the door of the apartment where she had lived for 42 years. All of it, every document, every hearing, every humiliation had been powered by money that originated in the criminal enterprise of a dead mafia underboss, laundered through a chain of shell companies designed by a man who had died alone in a cabin in the Berkshires with $2 million in stolen cash and a conscience full of ghosts. They had not evicted her because the building needed renovation. They had evicted her because the building was a liability. Stonebridge was systematically liquidating the last remnants of the Patriarcha real estate portfolio, clearing out long-term tenants whose rent-control leases were obstacles to the extraction of maximum value from properties that had been purchased with blood money 40 years ago. Vivian was not a casualty of the housing market. She was a loose thread being snipped from a tapestry of federal crimes that stretched back to before she had ever walked into Dorchester Savings Credit Union and counted her first stack of bills. She did not scream. She did not throw the ledger across the room. She sat at the kitchen table in the cabin of a dead man and cried silently with her hands still flat on the table and her shoulders shaking and the tears falling onto the legal pad where she had written her careful notes in the same small, precise hand that Harold had always admired because it reminded him of the markings on a good measuring tool. She cried for 11 minutes. She timed it not intentionally, but because the clock on the kitchen wall had a second hand that moved with a faint click, and she found herself counting the clicks the way she had once counted bills. Mechanically, automatically, a rhythm that kept her tethered to the world while the rest of her came apart. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her flannel shirt. She closed the ledger. She carried it downstairs, placed it back on the desk inside the vault, and swung the heavy door shut. It closed with a deep final sound that she felt in her sternum. She packed 3 items into a waterproof duffel bag she found in Drummond's closet. The oldest ledger containing the original Angiulo Shell Company records. The newest ledger containing the Stonebridge transfer log. And 1 brick of sequentially marked $100 bills, still in its original plastic wrapping, still bearing the 1982 Federal Reserve stamp. She locked the cabin. She walked the quarter-mile down the rutted driveway to where her car was parked. She placed the duffel bag on the passenger seat where Harold used to sit, and she drove east toward Boston in the dark 3 hours of empty highway unspooling before her headlights like a rope she was pulling herself along hand over hand. Martin Cavanaugh was still in his office at 8:30 in the evening, because Martin Cavanaugh was always in his office. The fluorescent light above his desk gave his face the color of old newspaper, and the air in the room was layered with the residue of decades of cigar smoke that had soaked into the ceiling tiles and the carpet and the fabric of the chair, where Vivian sat down without being invited and placed the duffel bag on his desk. She unzipped it. She took out the ledger and the brick of cash and set them side by side on the scarred wood surface between a cold cup of coffee and a stack of unfinished case files. Cavanaugh looked at the brick of $100 bills. He looked at the Federal Reserve stamp. He looked at Vivian. "Tell me you did not rob a bank," he said. "I did not rob a bank," Vivian said. "But I found the man who did. And I found something worse." She told him everything. The cabin, the measurements, the hidden room, the vault, the ledgers, the blueprints, the 40-year chain of shell companies leading from Gennaro Angiulo's North End office to the glass-walled headquarters of Stonebridge Partners. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping, and Cavanaugh listened without interrupting, his unlit cigar turning slowly between his fingers. When she finished, Cavanaugh set the cigar down. He opened the ledger to the page she had marked and read the entry for Property 409. He read it again. He closed the book and placed both hands on top of it as though he was swearing an oath. "You understand what you are holding," he said. "The cash is federal evidence. You cannot touch it. But these ledgers under the Department of Justice Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative and the SEC Whistleblower Framework. The government pays private citizens up to 30% of all seized assets derived from money laundering operations." He leaned forward. "Stonebridge Partners controls a real estate portfolio valued at roughly $400 million. If the DOJ moves on this and freezes those assets, you are looking at a recovery award in the tens of millions. Legal, clean, taxable but clean." Vivian did not blink. "I do not want the money," she said. "I want Roland Prescott sitting across a table from me when he finds out that the woman he threw into the street is the one who burned his empire to the ground." Cavanaugh studied her face for a long moment. Then he reached for his desk phone and began to dial. "You will get both," he said. The receiver was cold against his ear, and in the silence of the office waiting for the line to connect, Vivian reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the copper ruler. The brass hinges were warm from her body. She held it the way she always held it, folded shut, solid in her palm, precise and true. And she thought about the silence she had measured in the basement of a dead man's cabin, and how it had told her everything she needed to know. Measure the silence. The silence had spoken, and now it was her turn. Kavanaugh operated under conditions of absolute secrecy for the next 6 weeks. He made no filings. He contacted no colleagues. He conducted every phone call from a prepaid mobile he purchased at a convenience store in Quincy and kept in a locked drawer alongside the photocopies he had made of Drummond's ledgers. The original sealed in a fireproof safe he rented under his own name at a storage facility in Braintree. Vivian returned to the cabin and waited. Waiting, she discovered, was its own form of labor. The days were long and quiet and filled with a particular kind of tension that lived just beneath the surface of ordinary tasks, humming like a wire stretched too tight. She continued the renovation work because stopping would have meant sitting with her thoughts, and her thoughts had grown teeth. She sanded the kitchen cabinets. She replaced the cracked panes in the lower windows with glass she cut herself, scoring the sheets with a carbide wheel and snapping them along the line the way Harold had taught her 30 years ago when they had reglazed the bathroom window at the Cranston Street apartment. And he had guided her hands on the first cut and then stepped back and let her do the rest. She did not open the vault again. She did not need to. The contents were catalogued in her memory with the same precision she had once applied to end-of-day cash drawer reconciliations. Every figure accounted for every discrepancy, noted every total, verified twice. On a Wednesday morning in early May, Kavanaugh called. The prepaid phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and Vivian answered it on the second ring. "We have a meeting," he said. "Friday, downtown Boston. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit and a senior attorney from the DOJ Asset Forfeiture Division. They are skeptical, but they agree to look at what we have." He paused. "I need you there, Vivian. They need to hear this from the person who found it." The drive back to Boston was the reverse of the drive she had made 5 months earlier. But nothing about it felt like a return. The highway narrowed from mountains to suburbs to city, and the skyline rose against the gray spring sky like a wall, and Vivian felt no pull of homecoming, no nostalgic ache at the sight of the neighborhood she had known for 7 decades. The city had made its decision about her. She had made hers. The meeting took place in a windowless conference room on the 9th floor of the Federal Building on New Sudbury Street. 4 people sat across the table from Vivian and Kavanaugh. 2 FBI agents from the Boston field office, one in a suit and one in shirt sleeves, both younger than Vivian's daughter. A DOJ attorney with reading glasses and a legal pad. And a forensic accountant from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. A woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the focused, patient expression of someone who spent her professional life following numbers through dark corridors. Kavanaugh laid out the case in 30 minutes, speaking from notes he had organized on index cards in a sequence that built from the historical record to the present-day implications. He was precise. He was methodical. He did not editorialize. He presented the ledgers as what they were: primary source documents in the handwriting of a deceased co-conspirator. And he let the Federal Reserve blueprints speak for themselves. The room was quiet when he finished. The DOJ attorney removed her glasses and set them on the table. She looked at Vivian. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "walk us through the discovery. From the beginning." Vivian told the story the same way she had told it to Kavanaugh, without embellishment, without emotion, in the plain and careful language of a woman who had spent 35 years handling other people's money and understood that accuracy was more important than drama. She described the measurements. She described the cinder block wall. She described the vault and its contents. She described the moment she had opened the newest ledger and found her own address written in the margin of a dead man's tracking log. The forensic accountant had been taking notes throughout. When Vivian finished, the woman looked up and asked a single question. "You recognize the currency series from the Federal Reserve stamps?" "How?" "Because I counted bills for 35 years, Vivian said. The 1982 Boston series had a misaligned routing plate. The stamp sits 1/16th of an inch too far left. I noticed it every time a bill from that run came across my counter. It was never corrected until the 1987 print cycle." The forensic accountant looked at the DOJ attorney. Something passed between them that did not require words. The FBI agents asked Vivian to leave the room. She and Kavanaugh sat in the hallway on molded plastic chairs for 47 minutes. Vivian counted the ceiling tiles. There were 140. When the door opened, the senior FBI agent stepped out and asked them back in. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The legal pad was full. The DOJ attorney's glasses were back on. The forensic accountant had a laptop open showing what appeared to be a corporate registry search. "We are authorizing a formal investigation," the DOJ attorney said. "Based on the documentation you have provided there, is sufficient predicate to pursue asset forfeiture proceedings against Stonebridge Partners and its affiliated entities under RICO and federal money laundering statutes." She paused. "We will need access to the original vault and its contents. We will need your full cooperation as a witness, and we will need to discuss the structure of any whistleblower claim before we proceed." Kavanaugh nodded. He had expected all of this. "There is one condition," Vivian said. The room looked at her. "I want a mediation meeting with Roland Prescott, arranged under the pretext of a post-eviction settlement dispute, before the arrest, before the seizure, before any of it becomes public." The DOJ attorney studied Vivian's face for a long moment. "Why?" "Because he sat across a table from me once and told me I had no legal standing." Vivian's voice was level, and her hands were still, and she held the attorney's gaze without flinching. "I want to sit across a table from him one more time." The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday in late June. Kavanaugh's office sent a formal mediation request to Stonebridge's legal department, citing unresolved claims related to the Cranston Street eviction and referencing in deliberately vague language historical property documents that had surfaced during the course of the Millers' post-eviction relocation. The language was calibrated to intrigue without alarming. Kavanaugh knew that men like Prescott could not resist the opportunity to dismiss a nuisance claim in person, especially when the claimant was a 75-year-old woman with no corporate representation and no apparent leverage. Prescott accepted within 48 hours. The boardroom at Stonebridge Partners occupied the entire southeast corner of the 31st floor of a glass tower in the financial district. The table was mahogany, 12 feet long, polished to a depth that reflected the ceiling lights like dark water. The chairs were leather. The windows faced the harbor. Everything in the room was designed to communicate a single message: you are small and we are not. Vivian wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse. She carried no briefcase, no folder, no visible documents. She sat down across from Roland Prescott and folded her hands on the table and waited. Prescott looked exactly as she remembered. The tailored suit, the watch that cost more than her car, the expression of practiced patience that conveyed without a single word that his time was being wasted and he was being gracious about it. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "I have to confess I'm not entirely sure what we are here to discuss. The eviction was upheld by the court. The renovation clause was applied in full compliance with Massachusetts Housing Code. If Mr. Kavanaugh is hoping to relitigate a settled matter, I am afraid we are all wasting a beautiful morning." Kavanaugh did not respond. He reached into his briefcase, removed a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the mahogany surface. It was a high-resolution photocopy of page 47 of Drummond's original ledger. The page contained the entity transfer log, the chain of shell companies linking Harborview Associates to Stonebridge Partners, LLC, annotated in Drummond's cramped handwriting, with the name Gennaro Angiulo, circled in blue ink and connected by a hand-drawn line to the corporate entity that paid Roland Prescott's salary. Prescott glanced at the page the way a busy man glances at junk mail. Then his eyes stopped moving. His hand, which had been reaching for his coffee cup, froze 2 inches above the table. The blood left his face in a slow, visible tide that started at his forehead and drained downward until his lips were the color of wet chalk. He stared at the page for a long time. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper, stripped of every layer of corporate polish and boardroom authority, until what remained was the voice of a man standing at the edge of a hole he had not known existed. Vivian leaned forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "There was a man named Silas Drummond," she said. "He built your company's foundation, Mr. Prescott. Every shell corporation, every property transfer, every dollar that was washed through every building your company now controls. And when he disappeared, he took the records with him. Every single page. He tracked your operations for 40 years from a cabin in the woods. And when he died, the county sold that cabin at auction for $14,500. She paused. "I bought it." Prescott's composure collapsed. His hands were trembling. He pressed them flat against the table to stop the shaking. But it migrated to his jaw, to his shoulders, to the rapid, shallow breathing that fogged the polished mahogany beneath his face. "Listen to me," he said. "Whatever you think you have, you do not understand the scope of what you are interfering with. The people behind this company, the people who fund Stonebridge, they are not the kind of men who allow loose ends. Give me the original documents and I will write you a personal check for $5 million. I will return the deed to the Cranston Street building. I will make this go away for you." Vivian looked at him. She looked at his trembling hands and his expensive watch, and the harbor light falling through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. And she felt nothing. Not anger, not triumph. Only the vast, quiet clarity of a woman who had measured the silence and found the truth sitting inside it. "I buried my husband 5 years ago, Mr. Prescott. I counted other people's money for 35 years. I was evicted from the only home I have ever known by a man who smiled while he did it. And now I am sitting in this chair across this table holding the one thing your money cannot buy." She stood. "I have nothing left that you can take from me. And that, Mr. Prescott, is what makes me the most dangerous person in this room." The mahogany doors opened. 6 federal agents entered the boardroom in a formation that was both precise and unhurried, the way people move when they have rehearsed a sequence and know that speed is unnecessary because every exit is already covered. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with 3 yellow letters across the back, and they moved around the table with the calm procedural efficiency of people for whom this moment was a Tuesday. Roland Prescott did not stand. He did not protest. He sat in his leather chair and watched as an agent read the charges and another agent reached across the table and fastened steel handcuffs over his wrists, the metal clicking against the crystal of his watch with a small, precise sound that carried across the silent boardroom like a pin dropping on glass. Vivian watched from the doorway. Kavanaugh stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. When Prescott was led past them, he did not look up. His eyes were fixed on the carpet, and his shoulders were rounded. And he moved with the shuffling gait of a man who had just discovered that the floor beneath him was not as solid as he had always believed. Vivian reached into her cardigan pocket and felt the copper ruler, warm and familiar, folded shut against her palm. She and Kavanaugh took the elevator to the lobby. They walked out into the June sunlight. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the morning had not already said. The Department of Justice froze $412 million in Stonebridge Partners assets within 72 hours. The $2 million in stolen Federal Reserve currency was recovered from the Berkshire's vault by a 12-person FBI evidence team and returned to the Treasury Department, closing a cold case that had been open since 1983. Forensic accountants spent the next 4 months tracing the full scope of the Angulo Drummond laundering network through the modern corporate descendants it had spawned. 17 additional individuals were indicted. The Cranston Street building at 418 South Boston was seized, and 6 months later, under a federal court order, it was transferred to a city housing authority and converted into permanently affordable units for elderly residents on fixed incomes. The SEC whistleblower program awarded Vivian Prewitt 18% of the recovered liquid assets. Her attorney took his fee. The government took its taxes. What remained was more money than Vivian had earned in 35 years behind a bank counter, and she deposited it into a savings account at a small credit union in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 8 miles from the cabin. And she did not think about it often. 9 months after the morning in the Stonebridge Boardroom, on a Saturday in early March, Vivian stood on the porch of her cabin in the Berkshires. The structure around her bore little resemblance to the ruin she had walked into a year earlier. The sagging roof had been replaced with new cedar shingles that smelled of resin and rain. The porch was rebuilt in white oak planed and joined with the kind of care that Harold would have approved of. Each board fitted so closely to the next that you could not slide a fingernail between them. The windows were new double-paned, and they caught the early light and held it in long bright rectangles across the hardwood floors inside. The morning was cold. Frost clung to the grass at the edge of the clearing and to the bare branches of the birch trees that lined the property, and the air smelled of frozen earth and wood smoke from the chimney. And somewhere far off deeper in the forest, a creek was running beneath a thin shell of ice, making a sound like glass beads rolling slowly across a wooden floor. Vivian held a cup of coffee in one hand. In the other, she held the copper folding ruler open to its full length extended along the porch railing. She had commissioned a local carpenter to build. She measured the top rail, 42 inches. Exactly right. She folded the ruler closed one hinge at a time, listening to the small brass clicks that punctuated the silence of the clearing, and she slipped it back into the pocket of her cardigan, where it settled against her hip with the familiar weight of something that has been carried so long it has become part of the body. She did not need to measure anything else. The numbers had told her what she needed to know. They always had. The gap in the floor plan, the misaligned stamp on the currency bands, the chain of figures in a dead man's ledger that connected a crime family's past to a corporation's present. All of it had been there, written in the quiet language of measurement and precision, waiting for someone who knew how to read it. Harold had spent his life teaching her that language, not in lessons, not in lectures, in the slow daily practice of watching a man who believed that the most important things in the world could be known by paying attention to what did not add up. A door that does not hang true, a joint that does not close, a silence that is not empty, but full of the shape of what is missing. Measure the silence. She had measured it. She had found what was hidden inside. And she had carried it into the light, not because she was brave, not because she was angry, but because she was precise. Because she had spent her whole life handling things that mattered one at a time, with steady hands and clear eyes. And she had learned that the truth, like a well-made joint, does not need force. It only needs someone willing to hold the ruler steady long enough to see where the edges meet. The sun climbed above the ridgeline. The frost began to soften. Light moved across the porch in a slow golden stripe that reminded her, as it always did, of the measuring line Harold had named in their first apartment 42 years ago when the world was new and the numbers were just beginning to add up. Vivian Prewitt took a sip of her coffee and watched the morning open. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now and tell us. Have you ever measured something in your life and discovered the numbers did not add up? A space that should not have been empty, a story that should not have had a gap. We would love to hear about it in the comments. Share this with someone who believes that the truth always finds its way to the surface, and we will see you in the next one.